Hi, and welcome to Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Ruthie Blum, and I am here with my co-host, Mark Regev, who's actually not in the studio this week. He's somewhere abroad. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Ruthie. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you, too, even though it's across an ocean. So what I'd like to do today is discuss the meeting between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that took place yesterday. And afterwards, the two came out to the Oval Office and they made a statement and then gave a very, very lengthy press conference. So I'd like to ask you, what did you take away? What struck you the most about those statements and journalists' questions?
Well, anyone who watched the press conference of the two leaders, of the Prime Minister and the President, most of the issues, if you look at the time, weren't directed about Israel or the Middle East at all. Obviously, issues of tariffs and other issues were discussed at length by the President. But I thought the issues, when they did discuss our issues, Israeli issues, Middle Eastern issues, I thought it was very important what was said. And, the whole Washington visit was sort of last minute, at least for the members of the public. He was on an official visit to Hungary, and then suddenly we heard, out of the blue, I'm sure it wasn't out of the blue for the Prime Minister, but for us in the watching public, it was out of the blue that he was going suddenly from Hungary to Washington for a meeting with the President, which made Netanyahu not only the first world leader to have met the President after he was inaugurated, he's the first world leader to meet the President twice since inauguration, and as they kept saying on the international media, the first one to meet the President since he put these tariffs on all these countries, including Israel. So I think there's an important message here. Before we get to the content of the press conference, I want to say the following. It's clear that the big headline that came out was this issue of America starting direct talks with the Iranians starting this weekend. And it just reminded me a decade ago when there was an Obama White House. America started talking to the Iranians and Israel found out, but we weren't officially informed. In other words, we were deliberately kept out of the loop. And I want to say it's a testament to the current state of U.S.-Israel relations that this American decision and announcement was done in coordination with the Israelis, keeping the Israelis in the loop, allowing Netanyahu to hear it directly from the president before it was officially announced. And I think that is a positive sign of once again, a much more healthy relationship between Jerusalem and Washington.
Well, I'll tell you two signs of something not so positive. Yes, the relations are wonderful, and President Trump greeted Netanyahu. He came out of the White House to greet him as Netanyahu arrived in his car from Blair House. It was a very warm greeting, warm welcome, etc. But the Iranian question, well, there are two worrisome developments there. One is that I think all Israelis were assuming that because of the movement of weapons, for example, the B-2 stealth bombers that America placed on Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, pointing at Iran, the bombing of the Houthis in Yemen, all kinds of military materiel to Israel, that the assumption was that both the U.S. and Israel are gearing up to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. And when President Trump said, no, we're having direct talks, that was surprising because the whole week the Iranians were saying we are absolutely not having direct talks with America, only indirect ones or through mediators. This was news. This was the first anybody had heard that the Iranians had agreed to direct talks. So these talks are supposedly going to take place in Oman. And Trump said, well, with high-level representatives. He didn't specify which ones. So that was, I think, disappointing because you can't trust Iran, and I don't care what deal they make. It's not a deal that can be trusted. And when a journalist asked President Trump, how will, if you do sign a deal, how will it differ from the JCPOA, the previous deal that Trump ripped up in 2018? He didn't answer. He suddenly went on to talk about the hostages. I think either he misunderstood the question or he purposely avoided it. He didn't answer. So that was disturbing. And a second disturbing part of that that statement / press conference was what Trump said about Turkey and its President Erdogan.
So I want to respond. We'll talk about Turkey in a moment. I want to take on what you've just said and tell you that I disagree. Because I think, first of all, Trump has said since he's been inaugurated, he's a man of peace and he wants deals and he doesn't want war. But if he's forced to use military power, he will do so if it is necessary. And I think you can see the movement of the military, the US military is beefing up its positions in the Middle East. First of all, there's an immediate need, and that was stressed also in the press conference to hit the Houthis and hit them hard, because the Houthis are not just a menace to Israel, they're a menace to the world. And finally, someone is taking them on hard and making them pay a price for their terrorism and their aggression and their missiles against Israel and against ships in the Red Sea and substantially closing down the Suez Canal. So it's, those American forces are here and they're doing a job. But of course, the Iranians see how close they are to Iran. And I think here, if I can give a different perspective, when you say, well, you thought he was moving all these forces in and we were going to play tough with Iran, there's no contradiction. It's called, amongst the professionals, it's called coercive diplomacy. You move up your military assets, and the goal is to put pressure on your adversary to force him to accept a deal that he wouldn't have accepted without the pressure. It's a bit like Israel ratcheting up the pressure, I should say, on Hamas to try to get a deal to get hostages out. Yes, the use of military power, or the threat of the use of military power in the American case, to try to get a better deal. I said in a previous podcast, when Nixon wanted peace with North Vietnam and to end the Vietnam War, but he wanted to do it on terms acceptable to the United States, he bombed Hanoi to Kingdom Come. Not because he wanted to bomb Hanoi, he wanted to incentivize a peace deal, a better deal. And I think that's what Trump is doing.
Yes, well, he may be doing that. And I don't deny that it's significant that he's moved weapons and an aircraft carrier, etc. My problem is, A, he's not bombing. You said, yes, they bombed Hanoi. Well, Trump is not bombing any targets in Iran right now. And second, what does that mean, a better deal? When he was asked, how will it differ? If they do agree to a deal, how will it differ from the previous one? And he didn't answer. And my trouble is with this, that if Iran agrees to a deal, it will be a fictitious one. My criticism isn't of Trump, other than to say I hope that he's not going to be bamboozled by the regime in Tehran, because this isn't the time to let that happen, especially with the Iranians disgruntled and yelling, death to the dictator in protests. If Trump is persuaded that the Iranians mean to make a deal that prevents them from obtaining nuclear weapons, which, by the way, they keep denying that they're building, well, then it's going to be problematic. So that worries me. It doesn't worry me that he's using it as a tactic. It worries me, what if they agree to it? And then what?
I think we have to worry about the following. It's clear what the Iranians will try to do. They don't want Trump to attack. They don't want to be on the receiving end of US ordinance. And what they'll do is they've agreed to negotiate, and then they'll try to string it out and not give anything up, right? So I hope there's a clear timetable on this, that the Washington won't allow that to happen. That if the Iranians don't negotiate seriously, it can't be a game. Yes, it can't be just effective, drawing out talks. That's what happened in the past, yes? You draw out talks until it becomes meaningless, and that's your way of getting the pressure on. The only way to get a deal with Iran, and here I listened to the Prime Minister's language very clearly. the Prime Minister said, oh, we're in favor of diplomacy if you can get a deal like the one that was in Libya. Now, he didn't say that accidentally. The Libyan case was actually a clear example of a regime that had a dangerous nuclear program, who actually gave up the program, in contrast to the JCPOA, the deal that was done during the Obama administration that Israel was against. The deal with Libya actually had Libya give up its nuclear weapons. There's no doubt that that was a deal with a real result. It wasn't something fictitious. It didn't just stall the program. It didn't just put the program on ice and they could take it out of the freezer when they decided to. It actually dismantled their nuclear program. And Netanyahu said clearly, if you can get that through negotiation, that's a good thing. Now, I agree the probability of the Iranians agreeing to that is very, very low. But there's no chance, zero chance they'll agree to anything of the sort unless there's amazing, massive pressure on them. And hopefully that's what the Americans will be doing. I also want to say the following, and if I can make a comparison with the way Trump has treated Putin. Trump has opened the door to Putin to seriously negotiate on the question of the Ukraine, rightly or wrongly, depending on your opinion. But now that Putin has so far showed himself to be not serious, he's talking about sanctions, he's talking about pressure on the Russians. In other words, he opened the door, and if they don't walk in the door, he will be tough. And he has legitimacy to be tough because he can say, I offered you another outcome. And I think the same applies tenfold when you're talking about U.S. relations with Tehran.
Okay, so the reason I disagree with that is if you read the late great Middle East scholar Bernard Lewis, he always said there's a huge difference between, for example, Russia or the Soviet Union, that kind of war, Cold War with the United States, and Iran, because Iran is suicidal in the sense of, unlike Russia, Putin is not suicidal and he doesn't want his people killed. Whereas Iran is an ideological jihadist regime that wants regional and global hegemony. It doesn't play by the same rules as the West or even Putin. It glorifies death. That doesn't mean that each Ayatollah wants himself to be killed, but they're willing to sacrifice their own people, as we see that all over the world. We see that with Hamas, Hezbollah. You are not dealing with rational actors. You're dealing with ideologically religious, or you could say political religious ideology that is radical beyond belief. And therefore, the same, we have mutually assured destruction doesn't work with a regime like Iran. So that's why I'm doubtful. And all I am hoping for is that whatever goes on with these negotiations, you say they've got to come to the negotiating table. Great. Negotiating is not the end game, all right? Diplomats like to think of negotiations as some kind of goal in and of themselves. No, in this case, Israel is a target. Iran has vowed to wipe Israel off the map, has encircled Israel with proxies bent on its destruction. We saw also what happened on October 7th, 2023. The point being that I don't see how Israel can avoid bombing nuclear facilities, either going it alone or with the help of the United States. And I think the only parties who should be buying time here to plan that out are the United States and Israel, not Iran. We shouldn't be giving Iran a timeout. It should be reversed. And this has been a problem with the West fighting these forces. It's been a problem with Israel fighting Hamas in Gaza as well. It depends. You cannot allow your enemy to have time on its side.
Well, I agree with that point, Ruthie, because as I said a moment ago, the Iranians will clearly try to stretch out these negotiations like chewing gum and have it go on and not give any concessions. And I hope the White House just won't allow that. They'll say, unless you're serious. And the fact that if they're not serious, that America says it has other options, and they're talking about a military option here, I hope, and once again, you're allowed to be, I respect your right to be cynical, and this is not going to work. But if you want to go to a military option, which might be the end result anyway, it's good, I think, from a diplomatic point of view, from a political point of view, to say before we went to a military option, we tried all the other alternatives. The Iranian regime had a serious chance. That's important in building a consensus if you need to do a military operation. And so, if you are right, and the Iranians don't compromise, don't agree under the pressure in these talks to actually dismantle their nuclear program, and that has to be the goal. Not to freeze it like the JCPOA did so they can take it, as I said before, take it out of the cooler when it's at the right time for them, but actually to dismantle the program as was done in Libya under Gaddafi. If that's not achievable through diplomatic means, it'll be achieved by other means. And if the Iranians understand that, there is a chance, I'm not saying a good chance, but there's a chance that you will have a successful diplomacy. It's clear once again, you said diplomacy, everyone just loves negotiations, and you're right. That's where a lot of diplomats think. Just let's talking is better than other alternatives. No. Here we have to keep the eye on the ball. And the goal is Iran's military nuclear program will be dismantled. They cannot be allowed to get the bomb. They cannot be allowed to continue being a threshold nuclear country. That has to change. And that can be done two ways. And I think I'm paraphrasing both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It can be done two ways. It can be done through diplomacy, or it can be done through military means, but the end goal will be achieved. Iran's nuclear program will be dismantled.
Okay, so I just want to make one point before we move on to another topic of that press conference. And that is that it worries me more that Iran will agree to concede because the mullahs will be lying. And the question is, as we saw with the JCPOA, as bad as it was, it did have some kind of, bogus monitoring device in it or clauses. Because if Iran says no, that's easy. If Iran says yes, we're in trouble. Because the question is, you said they'll dismantle their nuclear capabilities. They won't. They might say they're doing it. And then you tell me how will it be different? Who will monitor it? And so, that is what worries me more than they're saying no, is that they say yes. But I'd like to also, go ahead, yes.
I wanted to say on that point that here we have to adopt the famous words of Ronald Reagan, who I think we're both old enough to remember as president. And he said when he was dealing with the Soviet Union, verify, trust, but verify. With the Iranians, let's say you don't trust, and you make sure you have to have verifiable mechanisms to make sure that they don't cheat. And the truth is our intelligence on what goes on in Iran is very good. I presume the American intelligence is very good. It's never 100%, but if we couldn't find the nuclear scientist here or there and take him out in the middle of Tehran, if we can take out a Hamas leader staying at the official state guest house, if we can attack and destroy for our Air Force, very strategic targets inside Iran as we've been doing, I think, once again, don't trust, but verify. And we can do that.
By the way, not to mention that amazing operation when the Mossad went to Tehran and emptied out a warehouse with all the documents, troves and troves of documents proving that they were building nuclear weapons. So, yes, you're absolutely right. But I'm saying we always say that. Trust but verify. It's the verification that we're having problems with. We know it already. What else do we need to verify? What we've seen is the International Atomic Energy Agency. A big help that was. The Iranians weren't letting inspectors in the sites. Anyway, so that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there will be no choice. There will be no choice but to launch some kind of military operation, and I hope it'll be joint. But if it's not, Israel will have to go it alone. But I would like to just say something that I thought was really, really important that Trump said that was sort of as an aside. It was kind of, off the cuff, but it was so important. And that was, He said Netanyahu is working tirelessly to free the hostages. Why was that so important? He said, yes, we're doing everything we can to release the hostages. We're working on it, he said, about the United States and about his negotiator, Steve Witkoff. But then he added, and so is Netanyahu is working, and he should be given credit for that, he said. Now, we know what's been going on inside Israel with the protest movement saying Netanyahu doesn't want the hostages back. And even what's very interesting in Israel is that many of the released hostages and their families have said it's only Trump. It's only thanks to Trump that we have any hostages freed. Bibi doesn't want them, and anyway, he's not doing anything. We keep hearing that. I don't know if people outside of Israel realize those voices are just getting stronger and stronger. I'm not saying that they are the majority in the country. But when you have released hostages, you had one on 60 Minutes, being interviewed on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. And he said, I owe my freedom to Trump. He said, I appeal to Trump to end this war, and I owe my freedom to Trump, only to Trump, he said. Now, I know we all feel for the hostages and the ones still there, the ones who are released, and you don't want to criticize them. But it is, I think it was necessary and important that Trump said that Netanyahu deserves credit, that he is doing everything he can.
And I think the current military operation, which started some 3 weeks ago, only started because Hamas stopped releasing hostages. We've got to remember that. There was 3 weeks before that when the ceasefire was still ongoing, and Hamas was not releasing any hostages. And then you had to ask, so what if Israel's not putting pressure on, what incentive do they have to release any hostages? That situation was, and we said it at the time, Ruthie, that situation was unsustainable. And I believe, we're hitting Hamas, and we're hitting Hamas hard in a very sort of surgical way now, in a very, I would say, we're being very clever with our tactics against Hamas and being very successful, I think, on the whole. But the idea that Hamas stops releasing hostages and we continue with the ceasefire, that is, of course, unfortunately, you're not going to get any hostages out. Now, of course, people are correct when they say, well, restarting the conflict, restarting the military operation against Hamas puts risks. Yes, there are risks to the hostages. Some of them will be murdered by Hamas. Some of them might inadvertently, accidentally be killed by Israeli airstrikes. Of course, that's possible, and you feel for the hostages. But the risks of doing nothing, the risks of continuing the ceasefire, you'll get no hostages, I don't believe, any hostages out that way.
Well, I totally agree with you there. I'm just saying that the protest movement, they've moved from, as I said, not all the hostage families, but the loudest voices, and it might be the majority of the hostage families at this point, and the families even of released ones, who are out they're saying, end the war, end the war. It's not only ceasefire, they want a phase 2, that phony phase 2, where Hamas we end the war, we leave Hamas in power, we withdraw from Gaza, and then they'll give us all the hostages. Or the other way around. We say to them, okay, just give us all our hostages, and okay, you can, we're ending the war. I find that outrageous. I find it outrageous that anybody's saying that aloud. That's not a good negotiating tactic. But I also find it outrageous that that's even being considered by anybody in this country who saw what happened on October 7th, to leave those bloody murderers in power, to do it again and again and again. I mean, we saw what we did with Gilad Shalit in 2011 for one hostage, a soldier hostage, and the country said at all costs, release him at all costs. And who was released among the prisoners in Israeli jails was Yahya Sinwar, who perpetrated the October 7th massacre years later. We cannot afford to do that. And so, that's an internal debate. And as I said, I want to repeat, I think it's very important that Trump made that statement that Netanyahu is doing everything he can and he deserves credit, because Israelis are not giving him credit. And it's pretty
I-
ironic that even the Israeli left is praising Trump. I think that's hilarious.
Some Israelis, not all Israelis, some Israelis. I think the country as a whole, knows to put the blame on Hamas. And one of the problems which people don't talk about enough is that if you leave Hamas in power, and one again, the war aims as articulated by the government is get all the hostages out, destroy Hamas's military machine, and end Hamas's rule over Gaza. And if Hamas, and it's not going to happen, yes, but if you accepted the Hamas blackmail, yes, and you allow them to stay in power, who's going to go live on a Bori kibbutz, in a community close to Gaza if Hamas remains in power, right? People don't think about this. If Hamas remains in power, it just means we have to sit and wait for the next October 7th.
Well, exactly. And many of the very same people who are saying just end the war and leave them there are people who actually, their homes are in those communities. So it's actually, we've gotten to a point, look, it's understandable that we're all on edge. We just marked a year and a half since the October 7th massacre. So yes, everybody's nerves are frazzled and all that. But okay, I don't know. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but to accuse the Israeli government of not doing enough to try to secure the release of those hostages is unfair. That's all I'm saying. There are people on the right who think Netanyahu isn't being forceful enough, isn't bombing enough. And then there are people to the left of him who are saying he's doing too much and he's endangering. Whatever your position on Netanyahu and this government is, you have to realize that every single member of the government wants those hostages home desperately. And anyone who says otherwise is being immoral, in my view. So now I would like to, now that I mentioned the word immoral, how about we talk about Erdogan, Turkey and Erdogan.
So you took it badly, and you'll explain to our viewers why. I actually quite liked what Trump said about Turkey. And I'll explain why. Turkey is going to have influence over the new government in Syria, according to everything that we have, according to all the information and all the understandings. That Turkey was a supporter of him when he was fighting Assad, and Turkey was very happy when he took over control of Syria. And Israel is concerned about a possible, if we have problems with this regime, which is the new regime coming up in Syria, that it could lead to a confrontation between Israel and Turkey. And let's be frank, Israel has no interest in an open confrontation with Turkey if we can avoid it. And I don't think Turkey has an interest in an open confrontation with Israel. And despite all the rhetoric and all the tension in the relationship and all the ups and downs over the last 20 years, we've never had a direct military confrontation between the two. And that's not by accident. We've had difficult times. The Marmara moment was a particular point of crisis, but we never had a direct military confrontation. And I think what Trump is talking about, and what appealed to me, he says, listen, I've got a good relationship with the Turkish leader. I've got a great relationship with you, Bibi, he said to him, right, when in the press conference. And I said, I love him. You're my friend as well. I can act as a conduit. I can make sure that we can reach arrangements in Syria whereby you won't have an unnecessary escalation between Israel and Turkey because of something going on in Syria. That understandings can be reached, deconfiguration. There are all these jargon that people on the strategic side you'll talk about. But the idea is to create a situation where you won't have an accidental escalation through Syria between Jerusalem and Ankara. And I think that's a good thing. Trump says he loves the Turkish president. So I don't particularly love the Turkish president. But if we can use the good offices of Washington to achieve some sort of understanding about Syria, that it doesn't become a point which drags Israel and Turkey into war, I think that's a good thing.
Let me tell you something. Turkey, Erdogan, is a radical Islamist, anti-Semitic autocrat with also hegemonic ambitions. He hates Israel. He hates Jews. He has done nothing but make trouble for Israel. You're talking about a direct military confrontation. I'm saying it is one thing to say, okay, we don't want a war with Turkey, and so we've got to have some kind of cold, I don't know, some kind of arrangement, as you say, is not the same as Trump praising him as this wonderful guy, okay? He's not a wonderful guy. He is a horror, and he has done nothing but attack Israel. That's number one. Number two, you cannot trust him in Syria, whatever he has ambitions to, if you think that's safe for Israel, you got another thing coming. Secondly, it's not the same as, for example, when Putin helped Israel, didn't help Israel, but enabled Israel. Netanyahu and Putin had come to a very important arrangement over Lebanon and Syria when Putin agreed not to down Israeli planes that were going to attack convoys bringing weapons to Hezbollah via Syria to Lebanon. And it was a very important arrangement because though Putin was, you could say, outwardly hostile to Israel in many times, and he's not a good guy, and Russia is not good under Putin, it was an arrangement that worked. But again, you see, we're talking between a rational actor. Putin, you could think he's evil or whatever, but he's a rational actor, and radical Islamists who are not rational actors. They are driven by an ideology that goes beyond realpolitik. And so I am uncomfortable when anyone, listen, and you know, I support Trump. I'm uncomfortable when he talked about him like he was, I don't know, Mary Poppins or something. Make no mistake, it's not true. And I'm sure Netanyahu was squirming in his seat, even though he didn't show it. So I am not happy about that. I think rhetoric matters. And it's fine if Trump wanted to say, look, I get along great. Turkey, we need Turkey. Israel needs Turkey, whatever. You want to talk that? You want to talk like that? Diplomatic relations? No, he was showering him with this warm embrace that was, frankly, nauseating, in my opinion.
So I think instead of looking at the words, and I understand why you find the words troubling, that the American president is praising the Turkish leader, I would urge you to look at the utility of what Washington said. And once again, I don't think Israel wants to see we've got enough real enemies. We don't want to escalate with someone who it's better to, try to get on with them if we can. And if the Americans can help us preventing Syria to turn into a sphere, an area where Israel and Turkish forces are going to start fighting, I think that's a good thing. I have no illusions about the Turkish leadership, yeah? He doesn't like us. He said things that have been, as you correctly said, openly anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel. But I don't think he's the same as Hamas. I think within that community, there are different strands. I'd remind you that just before the war, I think it was early 2023, President Herzog paid an official visit to Ankara, and there was a hope that maybe Israel-Turkish relations are going to a positive agenda. I think there was a meeting between the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Turkish leader. In other words, this guy doesn't like us, but sometimes if he thinks if it's in Turkey's interest to have a cooperation with us, he'll do so. So I have no illusions. We've got to be strong. But I think if Washington can help us find some sort of relations that work in the framework of a relationship which is pretty hostile, which is very, but if we can find relations to make that work, so a cold war between Israel and Turkey doesn't become a hot war, once again, I support that.
Well, it all depends, and I don't know. Look, what we do know, and Netanyahu has said this, and so far has been actually acting on it, is that we are not going to allow any threats to our border from Syria. And that now includes Turkey, of course. So if Turkey pulls any stunts, directly threatening us, we're going to have no choice and we're going to act on it. All right? If Trump wants to prevent Turkey from doing that.
Therefore, it's good. Therefore, it's good that America presents to Turkey exactly what's acceptable behavior in Syria, how far they must be from the Israeli frontier, can they fund? In other words, America can help us, I believe, reach understandings to prevent us getting into a bad situation. And I think if we've got a good relationship with the United States here, and Turkey's got a good relationship with the United States, let's accept the American offer, and let's see if we can try to calm things. There won't be love lost, yes? But if you can calm things down and prevent areas of friction, exactly what you said, there'll be understandings where Turkish forces don't go close to the border. Armed pro-Turkish militias won't go close. You can find arrangements, I hope, that will help keep our northern border quiet. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. No one wants war with Turkey if we're forced to fight, we'll fight, but we don't want war with Turkey. And if that can be avoided, that's a good thing. Ruthie, I'm sorry, I know I just finished talking, but we're at the end of our time. Do you have a closing remark?
Well, yes, because I would like to remind viewers that our JNS is hosting its first International Policy Summit on April 27th and 28th, and you can register on the banner on the YouTube video or at jns.org. And if you enjoyed this broadcast, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Till next week, Mark.